Hello, Standard. And joining me right now is Derek Frum. He is a lawyer with Warnock Kraft Anderson law firm out of Airdrie. And Derek, we wanted to speak a little bit today about some of the things that have been happening to Freedom Convoy organizer Tamara Lich, and some of the ramifications that have come down. So thanks for joining me. And why don't we start with how this, everything that's unfolded for her, what she was arrested for. Why don't you give us a little bit of a background on that?
Okay, so as I remember it right now, Tamara is one of the organizers of the Freedom Convoy. And one of her biggest problems, legally speaking, is that she was very successful. She successfully organized a very engaging, and it captured the minds and hearts of Canadians all across the country, protest. And it was political speech, very clearly political speech. Mm-hmm. And it became attacked from all angles. And, most of the claims, I think, have already been proven false. Like, oh, well, someone associated with the convoy was carrying a swastika. Well, that's been proven false. Oh, there was a fire, so arson. That was proven false. There was firearms associated, with the protesters. Well, that's actually been proven false also. Mm-hmm. And so this has gone on. And sometime early February, Tamara was arrested and charges were brought against her for mischief. Now, mischief is not a very serious offense. And she had a bail hearing. And, after being in prison for a significant period of time, she was released. And then sometime just before July, at the end of June, Tamara was picked up again from her home in Medicine Hat, Alberta. And this time it was for breaching bail conditions. So she was released with certain conditions in place. And she was alleged to have breached those conditions. Mm-hmm. And it seems to stem from a photograph that was taken of her, where she posed with another fellow protester. And right. And so the allegation is that she somehow breached her bail conditions, even though her lawyers had actually sought special guidance from the court whether or not this could happen, because she attended a gala event. Right. And that gala event was attended by this other fellow, and they both happened to be in the same place at the same time. And now Tamara finds herself in Ottawa, once again incarcerated.
Mm-hmm. And I understood that with that bail condition of not being around any other fellow organizers, that was without their lawyers present. But my understanding was that all of the lawyers were present.
That is correct. Okay. That's what the conditions were. And again, it's these sorts of orders, the way I look at it, is that what they're meant to do is they're meant to stop the offender from offending again. She posed for a picture in a public place at a gala event with somebody who happened to be associated with the same cause as she was. Now, mm-hmm. Again, this is all, and so she remains incarcerated right now. A justice of the peace, so not a lawyer, a justice of the peace, who I'm told is a former Parks Canada employee, has decided that she's such a threat to the community that she should not be released. And so let's just put this in a little bit of context. So during the Freedom Convoy, you may recall that there was somebody in Winnipeg who took a vehicle and drove it through a crowd. And he was, I guess you could say, an anti-protester.
Right.
There was 5 individuals who were harmed by being driven into. Now, this is, my opinion, quite obviously attempted murder. He attempted to murder at least 5 individuals. And he was released on bail. Tamara Lich, what's her crime? Mischief. And what was she doing? Well, she was actively engaged in political speech. And political speech, of which this protest, the truckers' protest is nearly sacrosanct in Canada. The courts have upheld this and withstood the government's forays into restricting political speech many times. including times when people felt threatened and felt scared. And of course, this is often fabricated. This is what people who don't like hearing what you have to say come up with. Because instead of just saying, I don't like to hear your speech because it makes me feel bad, they come up with excuses like, I felt threatened, or
Right.
honking is violence. So there's many examples of political speech being upheld as justified in this country. In fact, our democratic institutions, the courts have often found, our democratic institutions and our freedom as a nation are built upon the fact that we have this institution of political free speech. So Tamara's real problem here is that she was very successful. She organized a very successful and frankly embarrassing protest. It embarrassed the government. And it's difficult to see this through a different lens. If Tamara had, was only got 2 or 3 trucks to drive to Ottawa and they parked in the streets, she wouldn't be suffering as she is today.
Mm-hmm.
But she was very successful. She organized, and the same thing happens. She was very successful and embarrassed the powers that be in Ottawa. And now she finds herself, quite frankly, as a political prisoner in this country.
Right. So what are the implications of this moving forward, Derek?
Well, it is concerning because it suddenly has lowered the bar enormously for what speech might be illegal in this country. And it doesn't matter. It seems to me that it's really calling into question many of the cases that I know on these sorts of issues. Like, if you want to go looking, the Bracken cases out of the Ontario Court of Appeal. Those cases are clear. Political speech is extremely important. And it's the lifeblood of our democracy and our nation. It's what imbues our freedom with any sort of meaning, is the ability to speak. And again, this was a political speech. She was engaged in political speech. There's no laws that were broken here that we know of yet. And that's an important point. So in this country, this is the way our legal system works and our constitutional order works. Everything is permissible until otherwise proven that it's not. And so the reason murder in this country is illegal is because there's a law prohibiting it.
Right.
Now, it's the same thing with trespassing. Entering someone else's land is illegal because there's a law prohibiting trespass. But where there's no law, where the law is silent, you are free to act. And so Tamara, there was times when her opposition there in Ottawa during the protest, they tried to get an injunction to stop the honking from happening. And that judge who heard that injunction was very clear. This is not an illegal protest. There's no court that has found this protest illegal. So when we hear things in the media like it was the occupation of Ottawa, and it's just pure bias. There's no basis to that. It's bias. And so when I heard of the JP who made this decision recently to keep Tamara in prison, was using terminology like that, he's completely biased.
Right.
But he made his decision prior to hearing from her. And that's a big problem. And that leads me strongly to believe that Tamara is a political prisoner and that this JP had an axe to grind for whatever reason. Let your imagination run. I don't know what that reason is. But Tamara is behind bars today because she embarrassed the government.
But is it an axe to grind then, or is it more instruction from the government to this JP? I mean, I imagine you can't speculate on that, but
well, we can speculate. I don't think we have enough evidence to really draw any inferences, but that's one possible explanation based upon what we see. That is a possible explanation. Is that the best one? Is that the only one? I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure of that. But I think it's for those of us who are in Western Canada, for us, it was much clearer what's going on. And I would dare say that we have a much clearer view of the legality of it than many people do who are close to it. And so it just could be that this JP is caught up in the cultural foment that's going on in Ottawa right now. And it's just he's systemically biased or inherently biased. And it's not even an intentional a decision where he intended to keep her behind bars for illegitimate reasons. He just could be as much a victim of the narrative as many people are.
Mm-hmm. And so sort of using Tamara Lich as a sort of the poster woman for, you know, what not to do. Don't question, don't second guess your government. You know, do you think that that's sort of part of the plan as well, just to try and make sure that you know, anyone who's considering in the future some form of a protest will think twice now?
That's exactly right. There's a real chilling effect to all of this, and that can't be overlooked. Even discouraging people from exercising their legitimate constitutional rights is very problematic. When the government sets out to tell you that it's going to cost you and cost you dearly to exercise what is your right to do, they're putting a cost on that sort of behavior. And basically they're telling you, you know what, it might not be outward or overtly illegal, but it's going to be so costly for you that you probably should think twice and not do it.
Right.
That alone, that chilling effect is enormous and it's devastating. And quite frankly, that does is it just changes a little bit. It changes the narrative and changes what happens in the courts a little bit, because it's almost like a ratchet. The government pushes a little bit. We become used to a new normal. And then they push a little bit further until we get used to that new normal. That happens incrementally over time. And then after a number of years, we'll look back on this moment and we'll say, this is how we got here, one incremental step at a time. It's like the old metaphor about boiling a frog slowly from cold water. And that's kind of we're at that point now. We're seeing that incremental growth, and it's gonna start happening to journalists too. Like if this is happening to a protester, this is pure political speech. Political speech is nearly sacrosanct, as I said, in this country. When you go out and you protest against a policy, that's the sort of speech, and non-violently against a policy that you disagree with. That's the sort of speech that the government doesn't have any business controlling unless you're breaking a law. Now, I dare say that journalists are a little bit lower on that food chain. Journalism is going to be under attack as well. And I think we see that the seeds of that coming in the federal legislation, the censorship bill that's coming forward now. Like this is problematic. This is part of a larger agenda, I dare say. And it doesn't bode well for the future of a free media or protests or, frankly, citizens having opinions on what their government does to them.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, with you and many other civil liberties lawyers across the country fighting all sorts of, you know, constitutional challenges to the mandates with travel and whatnot, you know, how do you stop this slippery slope? You know, like, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people watching saying, well, what can we do to make sure this doesn't go down that way?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
It's a
tough one, I'm sure.
Yeah. And you know, that's where we start to speculate. I have to take my lawyer's hat off and talk more as just a Canadian citizen. Like how do we take control of our own country? Well, voting is one way. Mm-hmm. Protesting is another way. But, you know, here in the West, I think we have other options available to us where we need to start seriously saber rattling, because we are the ones who are funding the rest of the country. We hold the purse strings, and we need to be a little more serious about what we're sending away in terms of money, and find a way to make Canada listen. Because, you know, it's no surprise to me that Tamara Lich is from Alberta. It's no surprise to me. It's no surprise to me that another independent journalist, Andy Lee, looks like harassed in the last few days. She also happens to be from Alberta. And, you know, this all happened to Tamara just prior to Canada Day as well. Like it's starting to seem like the walls are closing in a little bit on Alberta and Western sentiment and our independent thought that we have here, because quite frankly, this sort of thought doesn't exist as widely and broadly elsewhere in Canada. Certainly not in Ontario or Quebec or the Maritimes. It's us outlandish provincials out in the West that only think this way. And so I think the West needs to get a little bit more serious about insulating itself from the terrible effects that Ottawa has on Canadian society and culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine. And as you mentioned, it really does come down to a vote. There are options coming up within Alberta. And, of course, I think the most important thing for people to do is really invest in knowing, invest in understanding what's at stake.
Yeah, that is correct. And I think, as much as our votes in the West don't matter federally, I think it's probably a good idea that we all try to flex our political muscles, as it were, to have Ottawa take us seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a political organizer. I'm not very politically astute, I'll admit that. But it seems to me that the ways to solve this are political, because the courts will generally backstop the government, as we've seen in this ordeal. And in matters like this that Tamara is facing right now, the ultimate remedy could be coming months from now. I mean, she's going to face trial at some point, and there'll be appeals. And the government does not like to lose. And when they do, they will always appeal. And their whole endeavor in matters like this is anyone who sticks their head up, they want to grind them into the dust. I saw that with my clients before when I practiced constitutional law. Mm-hmm. Anyone who opposed the government, even if they were being wrongfully attacked by some government law or regulation, the government it does not lose. It does not care about you as an individual. And its whole endeavor in taking legal action against Canadians in those contexts is to make an example out of you so that other people don't follow you as an example. And that's why I say it's quite clear to me Tamara is a political prisoner, and that the government will spare no expense to grind her into the dust to prevent future Tamaras from coming along.
Well, and speaking of the purse strings, that does pose a significant hurdle for many people, because I was just reading a ruling where they were going to put off a portion of a trial with regard to some mandates, and because of that, the government said that they would award sort of damages or they would be covering some of the claimants' legal fees in exchange for this sort of delay that they were requesting. And it's situations like that where it's sort of this unending access to funds to be able to, sort of, I think, control what it feels like to control the entire process.
Yeah. So I from my experience, I represented someone in Ontario 8 years ago who had a long battle with the government of Ontario regarding basically a food safety matter. Mm-hmm. And my client was not accused of anything other than, a regulatory offense that it caused no one any harm, and he was in some ways intentionally violating the law so that he could have his day in court. But what happened during that process, which we found interesting, was that we tried to find out just how much is the government of Ontario spending to put this prosecution forward. Like, right. It's over such a minor matter. And again, it's that they're taking a completely out of proportion attack on our client. Like, what's going on here? So when we made the Freedom of Information request, we were told, well, actually, there's no documents associated with your request to find out how much money is being spent. Because you know what? We don't docket our time.
Right.
We actually don't even keep track of how much time. And so in our mind, we're thinking, wow, that could be like, let your mind wander how much time they have. And something similar happened when I was involved with the Canby litigation. When I was with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, we made a request to find out, a Freedom of Information request in BC to find out how much the BC government was spending. Because we had heard rumors, they had spent, 20 million, 25 million, something like that, defending themselves against our private litigants' claims and a charitable organization's claims. We at that time had spent something like $7 million, which is an enormous amount of money for a charity to bear and fundraise for. And the government of BC, the privacy commissioner, ordered the release of how much they had spent, and it was opposed. The government immediately appealed it. And on the appeal, they were successful. And one of the reasons being that if the number got out, it would be so embarrassing to the government that I could use that number and embarrass them so badly, it would outrage people.
Well, and maybe you can confirm this on with Tamara Lich, or Leach, sorry. My understanding is that she was brought to Edmonton and then potentially flown to Ottawa in a private plane. Is that something
I believe she
heard?
is in Ottawa now, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how she got there.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but there were likely, costs, and if it was a private plane, significant costs associated with that. And again, to question whether she's a risk or poses a risk to society right now is it's interesting. And I think the problem is many taxpayers don't understand the implications to how much is being spent on these kinds of things. Yep. Would you say that you think the judicial system is broken?
I'm not there yet. I think judges are often bound. I think that's a lot of what we see. And in this last 2 years, these have been extraordinary 2 years. And many of the COVID-related cases that are going to be coming forward in the next while may reveal the answer to your question. But I have a lot of time for judges, because judges have to base their decision on legal reasoning, and they have to follow precedent. And it's hard to find precedent on these sorts of issues, precedent that applies. And we have legislation being slapped into place that looks difficult. We have governance by Twitter and press release, and the courts have a hard time. I am a little concerned with some of the things I've heard from the Chief Justice of Supreme Court of Canada, where he, in a French media interview, he said some things that were very concerning to me, that make him sound like he's biased. That if Tamara Lich were to appear in front of him on a matter like the one she's facing now, it would be difficult for her to get a fair hearing, because the Chief Justice comments look like his mind has been fully made up without having heard any of the evidence and having not heard any legal arguments. That's concerning to me. But do I worry about the courts in Alberta? I don't. I don't think we have concern at this point. They have to follow precedent. This is novel and new. Courts don't always get things right the first time. That's why we have appellate courts. And so I cut judges a lot of slack on these things. And I like to think that eventually we'll iron out these problems. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be a lot of work ironing out the problems, though.
And speaking of a lot of work, I think it's definitely going to be an uphill battle with a lot of the legal proceedings that are in front of us in the province and across the country, and even in places around the world. So
yes.
It's going to be kind of one of those things where we are just keeping an eye on how things are turning out. And my understanding is that a lot of the decisions will sort of become a cascade effect or a domino effect for legislation and for rulings across the country. So it's just a matter of time now.
Yeah, I believe that's the case. And I think that the great work, particularly of the Justice Center for constitutional freedoms, they've been punching way above their weight, to be frank. They've done wonderful work. And what I see them doing is having gotten a whole lot more information dragged out to the public that would have otherwise been hidden. And once the public sees behind the curtain and sees how decisions were made and sees what the decisions were really and who made them, the public's not going to be very happy with what is uncovered. That's what I believe is going to happen. And that's going to start happening across the country. It's going to happen in BC. Eventually, it'll happen in Ontario. And that, to me, is where I think judges will do good work. As good evidence is placed before them and they apply the law, the Constitution as it has been, because what I see as having happened in the last 2 years has been a vigorous attack on the rule of law by politicians and public health authorities. And quite frankly, what it looks like Justin Trudeau's crowd as well in Ottawa.
Well, I think you, as well as myself, will have our eyes sort of glued to all of the things that start rolling downhill once these decisions start to come in. So I'm sure you and I will touch base again when we can review more of some of the things that are still sort of in courts now. Thanks for joining me, Derek.
Thank you very much.